Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the northern parts where the Ukrainian forces managed to make a small advancement here northeast of Avdiivka. They're pushing back the Russian forces during their constant siege of the village as the Ukrainian forces hold on to the high ground and the fortified positions here within the village. The Russian forces are outside of it completely, and with the recapture of the forest lines we see that they have this buffer zone outside of the village, allowing them to be able to hold back any future Russian attacks towards the village and having time to get reinforcements to the area if need be. We then move on to the Bakhmut area where the Russian forces continue their attacks by Avdiivka and Klashivka, but there's been no developments in the area. Moving on to the Ukrianian area, we actually see that the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks in this direction, where they managed to capture this area here with a couple of forest lines and then move down towards the Russian positions in the hills, but the Russians were holding their positions and were able to withstand the Ukrainian attack. Well, however, this shows that there's an increasing amount of movement here that hasn't really been moved since 2014 before this. So we see that the Russian forces are now being pressured in a whole new area with the Ukrainian forces attacking in the direction of the Novomykhailivka area. We then move down to the Avdiivka part of the front line, where we here see that fighting continues all throughout the front line with a few territorial changes here in the south, where we see that the Russian forces managed to capture one of the trenches here in the southern parts west of the industrial zone in the southeast of Avdiivka, and fighting continues in the industrial zone and the residential area right next to it in the trenches here. We also saw that the Ukrainian forces actually launched a counterattack here in the Sarka area. However, they weren't able to capture any territory, but they were able to push back some Russian forces in the area, allowing them to increase the buffer zone, but not really take control over the area. Moving on to the Marinka area, we see here that the Russian forces managed to capture this area right here, where they managed to push the Ukrainian forces back, and this leaves a small part of the Marinka area under Ukrainian control, as a lot of this is actually a gray zone with hardly any possibility of units staying there due to the lack of fortifications or other areas to take cover from the constant artillery in the area, but this is also why slows down the Russian advances here in the area, with the Russian forces in risk of taking heavy casualties if they just randomly advance without much thought behind it. This is why we're seeing this sort of slow advance, because the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces are currently looking at a positional fighting where both are trying to avoid casualties as much as possible to continue the fighting that is going on. In the south of Novomykhailivka, the Russian forces close in further towards Novomykhailivka. In the past month, we saw them advance here in the southern section, about this distance here. But now we've seen them advance the final part here, getting very close to the village of Novomykhailivka, which is a stronghold of the Ukrainian forces here in the area with fortifications all over. With this advancement, the Russian forces managed to capture some outposts and trenches, allowing them to get closer to the village. As for the southern parts by the Stalemate and Novomykhailivka area, fighting continues with no real territorial changes. And in the end, in the Zaporizhzhia front and the Kherson region, we see that there are some positional fighting, not really clear where they are. There's artillery battles mainly, and therefore there's no actual reports of fighting and no territorial changes. In the Avdiivka section of the front line, we see the Ukrainian forces actually recording from their own perspective the Russian use of thermite bombs in the area, allowing them to demolish huge areas with these very hot incendiary munitions, allowing them to attack infantry over a large area, and as such we see that there is this constant use of these munitions. We also see a very interesting innovation in some part of the front line, where we see a Ukrainian drone carrier. It's a larger drone that has a couple of smaller drones on top of it. It flies deep into the Russian territory and Russian controlled territories, after which the smaller drones then use their own flying time to fly around. The reason for this is that the smaller drones have a less battery lifetime, and as such the longer they fly from, the less battery life they actually have to look for targets. So with this drone carrier, they use up the energy of the drone carrier, maybe half of it, so that it can return as well, and then the smaller drones will have more lifetime searching for targets instead of flying around and not finding anything ended up wasting that drone. So with this, there is more lifetime, and as such, they have more time to detect targets across the front line. So with this short overview of the front line, we then move on to this analysis. I believe is very important because we are nearing the end of November, and then we have the last month of the year, and then the war will enter its third year, 2024. So I had the decision and do an analysis of what I believe will happen throughout 2024. It is far in the future, and these predictions don't really go well. But here's my take as to what will happen in 2024. However, before I go into my own analysis, let's look through Syriac maps. He has made his own in response to someone who asked what will happen in 2024. And this is his response. Difficult to predict, but if the situation continues in the same way as in 2023, the front will not change much. We will see the capture of the city of Avdiivka by the Russian forces and perhaps a new attempt of the Ukrainian troops to advance in Zaporizhzhia. Right now, we can speak of a balance of forces between the two sides. The most feasible is that the imbalance begins to occur in 2024 in favor of the Russian side. But it is difficult to argue that this imbalance is sufficient to cause a drastic change in the field. The war of attrition will continue. The imaginations and wonderful cases that some people create in their heads, I leave to them. Reality is more complex. Remember that this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and NATO indirectly through Ukraine. Even repeating the mistake made by Russia in the conflict, the Ukrainian army would not have resisted so much if it had not been for its preparation during the 8 years under the supervision of Western countries. It is a truth that many are uncomfortable with, because they believe that willpower and the desire for freedom win battles. With arguments like this, it is better to distance oneself from this childish and irrational mentality. In short, the war will not end in 2024. I think it is a very interesting thought about the balance of power and the truth with this conflict. Looking at 2024, before that we have to look at 2023. And looking at 2023, these are all the recorded changes since January until the 31st of October, November not included. We see that there's hardly been any changes by the Dnieper River. There has been some advances by the Ukrainian forces, but not really much else. As for the Zaporizhzhia front, we saw that there was this bulge created, but that's about it. Even in the Remevsky Lech area, we see that there has hardly been any advances, especially since the end of August. Moving through the rest of the front line, we again see that there's been mostly just positional fighting. There's this small bulge created by the Russian army over the past 2 months in the north of Avdiivka. There's been this bulge created by the Ukrainian forces capturing Klishivka and Avdiivka south of Bakhmut, with some positional fighting in the northern flank. As for the Liman area and the Kharkiv-Luhansk border, we again see hardly any territorial changes. And I agree with Syriac when he says that this will likely continue for 2024, with the balance of power slowly going in Russia's favor. The reason for this is Russia has a better supply of ammunition, they have a better supply of essentially all types of weaponry. They gain much more at the front line than Ukraine does on a yearly basis, despite the collective support of Western countries. And this has become even more so true with the changes in the political state of the United States, with the continuous delay of further new political compromise on the budget for 2024. So far, Ukraine has not been promised any new money in the new budget. Therefore, we see a discontinuous delay for the 2024 season, because we see that Russia and Ukraine has become a side event with the Israeli-Palestinian war. And with that, we see that there is this delay with the support for Ukraine due to the amount of money being put there, too little to no results. As we see here in the Zaporizhzhia front, despite this long-awaited offensive, it didn't yield much results. And at the same time, we see that the money being put in there, it has a heavy toll on Western economies. We see that most Western countries have entered a severe recession. So if the support for Ukraine falters in Western governments like Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, decreasing their support, the United States having difficulties passing the laws, and even other countries hardly sending anything, like Spain and France have hardly sent anything since the start of the war, despite their own capacity to do so. Therefore, we see that Ukraine is facing a very difficult position because they are facing off against Russia, who has continuously since the start of the conflict just increased the amount of weaponry and training and amount of soldiers they sent to the front line, while Ukraine is now facing faltering supporters in the West. If that continues like this, it will significantly change in favor of the Russians. However, if the United States starts sending a $100 billion package to Ukraine for 2024, if the French, Spanish, German governments start sending more weapons, then the changes will be much smaller in favor of the Russian forces, and we'll see more of this positional fighting. So depending on how the power of balance depends heavily on the Western support for Ukraine. Like it or not, at this stage, the war is a battle of attrition. The one who loses the least and gains the most is the one who will win the battle. So yes, we will likely see a 2024 very reminiscent of 2023. However, depending on how much support the West gives to Ukraine, 2024 could be the last year of the war. If, for example, Donald Trump wins and he does what he has been talking about, saying that he will end the war in a couple of days with a peace treaty instead of fighting to the end, then we will see the war end in 2024. However, if the support for Ukraine continues and they increase the support and they continue with this, then it will become a continuous battle of positional fighting where we see that it will hardly move that much, reminiscent of 2023, with continuous positional fighting all over the front and slow advances for whichever side is launching an offensive. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.